and welcome back to Building New Virginia. I know it's been almost 7 months, over half a year since the last episode, but finally there's another one back. And hopefully it'll stick around, but make no promises as with anything, because I cannot do consistent uploading in any sense of the word consistent. But yep, it is back. And so today we go to the east side of the city. So the east side is, of course, I think pre-established in another video that was also working on the east side. It's the poorer side, the dilapidated and distressed side of the city, which is why this episode is called Distressed, because I'm not working on anything super significant, but I am working on neighborhoods that are, gonna fill in gaps and hopefully add cohesion to the map. Now that we have these row house assets, thank you to the game Trend finally porting over some assets, it has been a great, revelation or something, I don't know, to finally have some truly American looking row homes, and this project especially has benefited from that because, it's based in the Northeast, and a city like Baltimore does have a lot of row homes. But anyways, it's great to have these assets, and now I'm really starting to get on a roll with some of these urban neighborhoods because they start feeling more right. So right now, as you can see here on camera, I'm demolishing row homes. This is Carlisle, which was a formerly Irish neighborhood, or that's the idea, and I'm sort of going through demolishing row houses. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because, a city like Baltimore, which this area takes a lot of inspiration from, isn't doing the greatest right now. I think we can all agree. And many neighborhoods have, of course, had abandonment and vacancy rise as, people move out of these neighborhoods because they don't want to live in them. They're living in poverty or substandard quality, and of course, they're trying to find a better life. Of course, many of these areas are minority and especially black communities, and they're suffering. So they're some of the hardest suffering areas in our country. And part of it is due to, neglect from the cities, but also investments in things like highways and other urban renewal in quotation mark projects that don't really benefit the city residents in any respect. And a lot of these happen in the 60s and whatnot. Many of these neighborhoods you'll see here are around one such urban renewal project, the freeway, which tears through here. This is an extension of I-95 to the north that heads into the inner city and ends at what would have been a big bridge across the harbor into the lower parts of downtown New Virginia to make a little loop around downtown. That also connects up with the double-stacked freeway that heads along the west side of downtown. And the freeway thankfully never got its bridge built because community opposition in those close-in neighborhoods, stopped the highway plans once and for all. But of course, parts of their effects, and especially the poor and areas of the city that were less able to organize themselves in resistance to these freeways, they were still built. And so here we can see some of the ramifications of this. Building an abandoned home is always an interesting way to add interest to the block. I said interest twice, but ignore that. I use boxes, and I put the boxes in the windows, and that's kind of good enough because I don't really have a way to, make roofs cave in or add in falling walls and whatnot. The most I can do is boxes and boarded up windows and then graffiti. That's about all. So until we get, procedural objects in this game, it's unlikely that you'll ever see anything more than just boarded up houses simulating abandoned homes or vacant homes for that matter. So of course, this area is not entirely deserted. There's so many people who live in these areas, but they're all sort of suffering. It's not a good life in these places. These are often food deserts or areas where there's a lack of ways to get, not just food, but healthier foods. They don't have grocery stores, say a Giant, for instance, or I'm going to use a very white one, but Whole Foods, for instance, or Safeways and whatnot. These areas don't have anything like that, and it's kind of difficult to get food, and you have to drive or walk or take transit very far away to get food. Or maybe there is food, but it's a bunch of junk crap and stuff that you'd normally find in a convenience store and not like an actual supermarket type ordeal, you know? So that's definitely one issue of many of these places that sort of hastens the decline of poverty. And it's kind of interesting looking at the difference between cities like Baltimore and DC, where, Bowser in DC is trying to, sort of throw money, I guess that's the issue, where she's trying to, promote grocery stores in wards 7 and 8, which are the poorer wards of DC. And meanwhile, Baltimore is just stagnant because Baltimore is getting barely attention or investment at all as a city, and it's just much more difficult to deal with these food deserts. And it's an interesting sort of difference in dynamic between these two cities, even though they both have, large, poorer areas of the cities. So it's not like they're so different, but they're also extremely different at the same time. It's kind of interesting. So anyways, working on homes, adding in basic backyards, which is one thing I've noticed, especially now as I get more and more, detailed and into building these backyards. I notice it's taking even longer to build stuff. I look at some parts of the city that are sort of to the southwest across the river, and I look at, wow, I was able to get so much done in so little time because it was simply place down a row of homes, put in a back wall, and then put in trees and some garages and whatnot, and it looks decent enough as is. But now I'm going in, adding separate fences, bushes, cars, maybe an occasional shed and garage depending on the neighborhood, and all sorts of stuff to sort of give these neighborhoods a bit more life. And it's much easier to do that now because of the new houses, and of course also adding in vacant lots, which is something you can see me doing right now, adding in different grass textures and then also weeds growing up in these vacant lots. So yeah, a lot of detail goes into these neighborhoods, and so it's kind of funny because a lot of this isn't near like an area where you'd see it from like a cab ride, and I do want to do cab rides on this map at some point, but I just really play this in a different perspective to say most TPF players. Oftentimes people will be building for like say a cab ride or something, and so they'll focus all their detail along the train line where you can see it from the train. But here I'm sort of, building a big comprehensive city like what you'd find in say City Skylines, where you have this big overhead shot looking at the city, or I'm trying to tell the stories of neighborhoods, and it's kind of a very different take on how to build a city in this game. But I think it's kind of interesting. I mean, the project I think looks extremely good in my opinion. I love the way the city looks and how it's coming along. Every time I look at the new aerial imagery, it's just absolutely great and cool to sort of see an actual real life feeling city. And speaking of the aerials, I do occasionally, go ahead and, use the screenshot tool to go across the entirety of the map and take photos of it from a satellite point of view. And then I stitch those together and I get the New Virginia map stitches. And so those are like satellite imagery photos of the city, and they're sort of used to sort of keep an eye, or not keep an eye, to give an idea of where things are. And so I usually update them periodically, but not that often. And so there is a new one. We have the 7th one. And so if you want to sort of see the new sort of areas, it doesn't include what I build in this episode, but it does include some of the other ones that are just to the north of here. And those are on it, and so you can sort of see those areas, and you can kind of see sort of how the east side now is really making a lot of progress. For the longest time, this sat with a lot of buildings, but it didn't really have a lot of detail to go with it because I was using a lot of the old residential assets by Siri, and those are great now. I like the assets, but they aren't really American feeling, and it's kind of a sad thing, to really try and make American feeling neighborhoods, and the assets just don't quite match. But now that we have these row houses, it's like 10 times better, and you can actually sort of see, or not see, feel the Americanness in these areas. And yes, I did just use Americanness. Anyways, this is an abandoned corner store, so, again, going through the details of boarded up windows and then graffiti. Again, not much else I can really do beyond that in many cities. But many cities? Oh, whatever. My screen literally just blacked out there. Only the most professional recording here. But I can only do so much, again, as I said earlier, until we get like PO, caved in roofs, and walls just aren't a possibility in this game. But I think it sort of communicates the message across. Here, I was trying to find a shopping cart because I wanted to put more junk in front of the neighborhood building. I put some wood, so I guess maybe they're like stripping out the interior or something of this building, and that's why it's sort of like messy out front. I don't know. I'm just trying to, make it look more interesting than just, say, a building boarded up in graffiti. Like, cool, but like, we have seen this thing many times before, and it's about as far as I can get to sort of communicate the idea that this is an abandoned building. No one really cares or looks after it anymore, and it's only a few days. Its days are numbers, essentially, until the city authority has to come knocking it down because it's a little safety liability for people in the area, And that's sadly something Baltimore has to deal with. Many homes are owned by the city with no one living in them, and so there's either two ways to sort of tackle this. One, you get the wrecking ball out, and two, you can try and sell them off to some people who might be interested in investing in the area. What's interesting, though, is that a lot of areas in Baltimore where they're really hit the hardest, there's just no move to like invest in them. And so you don't get a lot of people who are, taking advantage of, say, the dollar house program in Baltimore, where you can like buy a house for an absurdly low cost, because they're in a part of the city that no one really wants to live in, and it's kind of depressing because these homes still keep getting torn down and neighborhood decline is only getting worse as homes are put up for sale for great deals, but no one really wants to buy them. Some of it's around a perceived issue of crime and such, which is very prevalent in many of our American metros. Not to get too urbanisty, but I do think the channel City Nerd put out a pretty interesting video about sort of crime in cities, that it doesn't directly talk about Baltimore, but it kind of relates to the issues that Baltimore faces. I've just been reading a lot about Baltimore recently, and it's kind of been utterly fascinating. A city that in its metro area is not that poor. It's kind of comparable to DC, and no doubt a lot of its growth in the suburbs is because of being close to DC. All the areas around, say, Fort Meade and Columbia, no doubt have prospered because of, close proximity to DC. But then you also get the inner city, which is just dying. It's a Rust Belt city in the city center itself, but outside, it's like Sunbelt T, kind of. Sort of like DC sprawl in many respects. So it's kind of interesting, Lots of educated workers, I think it's like 40%, which is comparable to many other cities, like in, say, the Southwest, like Texas. And its median income in the MSA is also like $80K, like 83,000 or something, and DC's is like only 105K median income. So, the Baltimore metro area is by no means like a very poor area, like, say, some of the Rust Belt cities where, like, yes, the city center is hurting hard, but so is the entire metro area in a sense, because they don't have a very strong future. No one really wants to move in them, but the opposite is sort of true in Baltimore. Well, half true, half opposite, I don't know. Where there is a lot of movement to the suburbs because there's a lot of jobs there and a lot of, high-paying ones as well. But the city itself is just declining in every respect, with the word declining. Downtown businesses are being shuttered. Apparently there's buildings that go up in flames and then never get repaired on places like Howard Street, where the light rail runs. And it's not a good picture, it seems. Baltimore, out of all the cities in the Northeast, lost population, which is between 2010 and 2020, which is not good. Every city, including DC, Philly, New York, and I'm pretty sure Boston also fits this, but not 100% certain on that. gained in population between 2010 and 2020. Baltimore did not, and it's like the only major northeast city to like do so. So, and major as in like major on the Acela corridor. I'm not including Wilmington, Trenton, or even Newark in this. Sorry, but yeah, it's just sad. You know, New Virginia isn't as sad as Baltimore. It's definitely got a bit of movement and kick into it. You know, the southwest area is sort of supposed to be the gentrified area of the city. You know, the homes are much more nicely kept and a bit more love put into them. But here the east side is straight out of places of Baltimore. Instead of like the black butterfly that you have in Baltimore, you more get like the very strong east-west divide in DC, you know, where the east side is very not as prosperous. I don't want to say poor because it doesn't really sum up all of the suburban areas in that part of DC area, but they're not exactly like kicking alive like say, you know, the northwest areas of the city along the Dulles corridor and into Montgomery County as well. You know, the economic divide in DC has different ramifications, but it's still there nonetheless, and this city sort of has that similarity, but I don't think I want to take it into the suburbs. Anyways, after that very long talk about cities, I am building a strip mall. I know, very entertaining. But this is something I sort of imagine the city did a lot in like say the 70s and 80s, you know, funding sort of like community redevelopment projects. And they're like, what do communities need? They need strip malls. And well, nothing inherently wrong with trying to bring more retail to an area. And this no doubt hopefully tried to address some of the sort of like food deserts that you find in many poor areas of our cities. It's no doubt sort of like a bad way to incorporate land use in what are still fairly urban areas, you know, is of course the main way to get to these areas is by driving, because that's sort of how a strip mall works. And so of course it's not the nicest place to go to on a pedestrian, and it definitely sort of sticks out like a sore thumb amongst other land uses in the city. And so it's not the best use of land. I mean, I guess it's better than say an empty lot, but like in terms of like integrating retail into a community, there's definitely far better ways of doing that. Yeah, so building the strip mall, trying to use this very dated looking style. You can see the autosave I looked out. Here I'm putting in little not decals, that's city skylines. Textures that sort of show like potholes and such, and I'm doing water decals to sort of make it look like there's drainage issues. Just overall, this is not a very well maintained parking lot. Yeah, doing a little extension back here, and this is for truck loading docks, because yes, this is going to be semi-truck loaded. Yeah, of course they're gonna have semi-trucks be the main way of transporting stuff into like a strip mall like this. You know, you don't need much really in terms of commercial vehicle size to transport into like retail, but of course strip malls are designed around cars in literally every sense of their aspect, every aspect of them, whatever. And so they, of course, are going to use tractor trailers as their primary means of delivering goods to the stores in the strip mall. And yeah. Now doing little AC vent details. I have no idea how any AC system works, so I'm just plopping down stuff to make it look interesting. Because yeah, I mean, a boring roof is a boring roof, but when you have AC stuff on it, it actually makes the roof feel like realistic, you know? And so that's why I do it. And so, yeah, putting on AC details that look real, but are definitely not 100% accurate to like how a code would work. Last little bit of detail on this strip mall, putting up more like little signs, and this would have had. I noticed this one. The strip mall I was taking inspiration from in Baltimore sort of had these little plaques where you assume a big name store would have been, but they were just empty, and they had the main sort of signs for stores on the little thing down there. And so I was like, that's an interesting detail I want to replicate, so I did that. And so you have those big plaques, but there's nothing on them. You know, most people don't pay attention to them. And of course the signs are going to be on those little sticky outbits where they provide shade. Not going to put glass on this one because too much effort, too much work, and you're never going to notice it. You know, glass is sort of a afterthought. I'm really trying to get the shape of these buildings down because you're always going to look at them from a very far away perspective. And a glass in that little tiny crevice is not going to be noticed by anyone unless you're looking at it straight from the ground below. And you know, I like sometimes doing screenshots like that, but not every time needs to be sort of that low down view. It's great and all, but this is designed from like sort of a top down perspective, you know, like how City Skylines or SimCity plays, and how this game frankly plays. You know, about the closest thing to ground you get in this game is the cab ride stuff, and I love watching cab rides and love watching people create cab rides, but again, this isn't the map for that. So anyways, moving along, I built like putting a bunch of graffiti on this wall. I thought like maybe this is like some kind of local neighborhood treasure where it's a giant flat brick wall and that the strip mall owners just don't bother to maintain it at all, and so all the neighborhood youths know about it, and so they just pepper it with graffiti every chance they get, which is why there's a crud ton, you know. It's interesting to think about how graffiti works, and like, you know, you're not gonna obviously have the time to make some immaculate piece of art in a very high visibility area or where a lot of people are gonna be, but you can maybe get a quick sort of tag or stuff on it. Do keep in mind, this is coming from a kid who lives in suburbia, so don't quote me on this. But like, so I try to replicate that and sort of like putting, you know, the black sort of graffiti marks on sort of more visible areas, but then, you know, in say like a side street or a back alley, I'm gonna put, you know, nice, big, immaculate, beautiful, you know, painting style ones that you see in the graffiti packet, which is really good for this project as well. You know, it just adds that sort of big city vibe, you know. It makes the city feel not only more lived in, but more true to what it would look like, more gritty and such. You know, no city's ever perfect. And while I don't really see a lot of graffiti here in DC, it's definitely like not non-existent. It exists. Alright, and now I'm back. And so, turn with the continual plopping of row houses, just commentating on whatever I see in my second monitor, but just continually working on the row houses and such. There's a lot of them to plop in this city. You can see sort of how big this city is, but yeah, it takes a lot of plopping and patience to, you know, build out these neighborhoods. You know, unlike City Skylines, I can't just say use zoning and then have a neighborhood grow automatically. Wish I could, but of course that's not a thing I can do. Also, can't have backyards in the same way, because lots have to sort of be terrain conforming and flat. In this game, I can't, like, say, have a sloped backyard that follows the slope of the area. I do wish, however, these assets weren't terrain conforming. So that's just like my one nitpick. It would be nice, and that and collision were turned off. But I mean, collision isn't as big of a issue now that we have skip collision mod. Thank Christ for like the most beta of anarchies in the long list of anarchies they have for City Skylines. We also kind of have very beta Move It, which is also really cool. I would really like to have full Move It, but I know that's very unlikely. And unless someone has somehow the sort of brain power and coding as some of the City Skylines mod and community does, I don't foresee it happening. And, you know, I am still amazed at some of the stuff that you can do with City Skylines, like how, you know, what's that mod called? I literally just went out my head. The one that is basically Blender in the game. Procedural objects, thank you. No one's near me. Procedural objects is such a mad mod. I don't get how someone literally put Blender in the game, but they did, and it's kind of cool. You know, unlimited creativity freedom for, you know, City Skylines maps now, because you can basically make anything you want based off any object in the game. So, really cool mod. Not sure if I want it here because that feels like it'd be so much effort to try and use just to get the perfect thing. I'd rather just stick to assets because it's just so much less time consuming and easier to get along with. Plus, it still looks good at the end of the day, you know. Sure, assets can get repetitive and it might not look 100% true to real life, but that's sort of a trade-off I'm willing to make. You know, this is my own city. It's not supposed to be a one-to-one recreation of Baltimore. It's supposed to be, you know, its own mashup of different places. Yeah. Building more vacant lots, backyards. I want to sort of talk about how there might be like trees or bushes. This is supposed to sort of be like, you know, the house was abandoned and yeah, trees grew up in the backyard and now they're really big. And so they've sort of overgrown in this state. Something I noticed a lot when street viewing places like in East Baltimore. So I tried to include that. More abandonment. Yeah, this house is going to have an inconspicuous amount of cars outside for reasons that will probably not be disclosed, especially not to that of the police. Yes. Yeah. We'll just move along from that. Look the other way. Don't snitch. Yeah. Put more graffiti on it, of course, because, you know, graffiti adds to that sort of vibe and aesthetic. And of course, using some of the more not as artistical, that is probably not a word, you know, not as artist-like ones, because again, you're not going to really see that in the streets or in very visible areas. So, yeah. I think I'm coming up close to the end of the video, and I'm just doing the last bit of fence work in this area. One of the few non-metallic fences. That's another thing. I have sort of like a fence set, which is mostly comprised of the metallic ones. That sort of is what I use throughout the city in these areas. Don't have like a low-rise chain link fence, which is what I normally see, but I think this sort of works in the same way. That one right here. It's pretty good. I think it gets the point across, and yeah. There's a lot of metal fences because, you know, you don't want intruders on your property. Though I don't know how likely that is in an area like this compared to a normal area. I don't know. But like, it's just something I sort of noticed when street viewing some back alleys and places around Baltimore. So I was just like, something I wanted to replicate. You know, a lot of this area comes straight from Baltimore. Looking at sort of things you see in the more, you know, bombed out is a term I used, areas of Baltimore, because that's what they literally look like. It's like if some kind of World War II bomb raid went over them and just laid hell, you know. It's sort of ironic, you know, how Americans we would bomb our enemy cities during World War II, but then when we came home, we would slowly start a process that would in turn bomb out our city centers in the years that follow. It's just sort of a interesting way to see how history goes. You know, many American cities do look like a war has literally hit them, and it's so sad and just depressing, you know. These places are oftentimes former husks of themselves, and they just aren't the same as they once were, and nor will they be the same, you know. Great neighborhoods were often lost in those, you know, urban renewal projects and through the abandonment. And, you know, in cities like Baltimore, it can still be hard to sort of stave off the tide of devastation in some of these areas. People still moving out because, of course, these neighborhoods aren't places people want to live, and so if they get the chance, they leave. It's an understandable desire, really. It's, like, not something you stop. Anyways, that's the end of the video. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you enjoy this video. Yeah. I do have another channel going on called the House of Transit Podcast, and yeah, go check that out. Made some videos there. And yeah, that is from me. All from me. Bye for now.